Thank you everyone for coming in. I know it's pouring out there, and I really appreciate you guys showing up. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. And my name is Rami Yaqub. I'm the Deputy Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. TIMEP is a non-profit organization that seeks to amplify the voices and views of people from the region in discussions here in the United States. We are very pleased to host this event today with our distinguished panelists to discuss Egypt's economic landscape. It is no secret that Egypt faces tremendous economic challenges, including a dysfunctional subsidy system, a growing national debt, and high unemployment rate. At the same time, Egypt faces an energy crisis that is hitting both the average consumer and the large industries alike. The public is bracing itself for continuous blackouts this summer, among many other concerns, including the reintroduction of highly polluting coal power by industry. Successfully addressing these problems will require not only support from private investors and foreign direct investment, but also the adoption by the government of measures that promote job growth, curbing inflation, restructuring subsidies, balancing Egypt's budget, increasing transparency, and encouraging productive investment. Real efforts must also be made to curb corruption, whether involving the application of existing laws or the creation of new ones. Here today to discuss these critical issues are esteemed guests, Mr. Angus Blair, Mr. Justin Dargin, and Dr. Paul Salem. Mr. Angus Blair possesses 30 years of investment banking experience and has led groundbreaking capital market deals across the Middle East and North Africa region. He is the founder and president of the Signet Institute, a research organization that focuses on issues pertaining to the business environment of the Middle East. For over 20 years, Mr. Blair has specialized as an analyst and economist focused on the MENA region. He also has won a number of awards for his economic and general research. He has also worked with many key governments and business figures, from Morocco to Oman, and he is a keen observer of the region's politics. Mr. Blair has been based out of Cairo for over 8 years and regularly travels across the region, having visited Oman, the UAE, and Lebanon just in the past month. Mr. Justin Dargin is one of the largest leading Middle East energy experts. He has worked as an energy and Middle East scholar at the University of Oxford, as a Saudi Aramco Fellow, and as a Fulbright Scholar in the Middle East and North Africa. Formerly, Mr. Dargin was a research fellow with the Dubai Initiative at Harvard University, where he won a Harvard Award for his research on the region. Mr. Dargin is a specialist in international energy law, and he has written extensively on carbon trading, the global oil and gas market, the legal framework surrounding the Gulf energy sector, regional industrialization, and Middle Eastern geopolitics. Our moderator today is Dr. Paul Salem. Dr. Salem is the Vice President of Policy and Research at the Middle East Institute, where he is leading an initiative on Arab transitions. He previously served as Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, Lebanon. Dr. Salem was previously the General Director of the Ferris Foundation, and prior to that, founded and directed the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, Lebanon's leading public policy think tank. Dr. Salem is the author of a number of books, articles on the Middle East, and is also a frequent television and radio commentator on issues relating to the Middle East and the Arab world. Our panelists' discussion today will be followed by a Q&A session moderated by Dr. Salem, who will kick off the session with a few questions, and then follow that, we'll open it for the rest of our guests. With that said, I would like to ask you all to join me in welcoming our distinguished guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami, and I want to salute the Tahrir Institute, which has really brought an excellent new voice, an Arab voice, an Egyptian voice to policy making and policy discussions here in Washington. We are all eager to hear from our two excellent panelists, and Rami did introduce them. We're all concerned about the developments in Egypt and are all aware of the importance of economics in terms of jobs and prosperity and growth, and how that can ease some of the crises of the population there. So as Rami mentioned, our panelists will start with opening statements perhaps from the podium. I think Justin will go first to talk a bit about energy, issues related to that, and then followed by a presentation by Angus on the broader economic situation. So Justin, please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, both Paul and Rami, and also I appreciate all of you braving this tumultuous weather to hear us speak. So we hope that we can create a type of vibrant and interactive session for all of you. So we're quite appreciative. Pardon me. I'm going to speak about energy issues in Egypt and how energy is connected with the current social-political unrest in the country. And really, we have to understand that energy is key. So without a resolution of the energy situation within Egypt, you really can't resolve many of the other issues which are percolating at the moment. So if we consider Egypt, Egypt is known as Dunya, as most of us know, mother of the world. And Egypt, of course, was the center of the ancient world for a long time. In addition to that, even though Syria was the midwife, Arab was really the mother of also Pan-Arabism, or Uruba, during the time period of the 50s and 60s, late 50s, 60s, and even to a certain degree in the early 70s and what have you. So Egypt is essential for regional security. Indeed, I would say security throughout the entire MENA region. Now, I don't want to go through the entire litany of problems that Egypt is facing at the moment, because we know that they're quite significant. But we do know, since the downfall of the former president, Hosni Mubarak, in early 2011, Egypt has experienced significant problems, of course, with foreign revenue, which has declined quite significantly. Egypt has also faced problems with trying to regain the critical tourism revenue, which really has not reached the pre-revolution levels. In addition to that, Egypt was on the precipice of economic collapse, but for the grace of its GCC patrons, which have assisted Egypt immensely. So of course this list is not exhaustive, but it's just some of the severe challenges that Egypt is facing. But nonetheless, Egypt has quite recently undertaken some steps to attempt to revitalize its energy sector. And I think that these are steps in the right direction, even though these steps are not necessarily final steps whereby they can absolutely solve all the problems. But I think that at least it indicates that there is some will on the part of those in authority that something must be done in order to solve these crippling energy shortages and the natural gas deficits and what have you. But we still have to consider one thing, though. Despite these steps, from the short to mid-term, Egypt is still going to have significant problems in its energy sector, and is still going to experience blackouts, and the blackouts are actually increasing year on year, and it's still going to experience natural gas deficits. But I think that eventually these problems will be resolved. But from the short to mid-term, no matter the steps are undertaken at the moment, Egypt is still going to have quite significant problems. So to put it in context, Egypt is facing a strategic dilemma. And what the strategic dilemma is whether Egypt should meet its domestic energy consumption, or demand rather, which is obviously concerned mostly with hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas, and which thereby lead into power demand, or whether it wants to focus on export of energy to the international market prices, which of course is a crucial hard currency generator for Egyptian economy. So that's the strategic dilemma that Egypt is facing at the moment, and what is to be done. However, before I go into that, I would like to discuss the timeline of the problems. So contrary to conventional wisdom, the problems that Egypt is facing in terms of its energy and power sector is not the result of the revolution that occurred in 2011. No, these problems actually were derived from a political decision, indeed many political decisions that were undertaken in the late 1990s. And these political decisions that were made were meant to privilege natural gas production and consumption at the expense of oil consumption. Now, why is that? Well, we have to look at it holistically. Egypt, as many MENA countries, considered itself to be an oil country. Okay, so what I mean by an oil country, an oil-producing country, even though it's not as significant as other countries in the region, but still, oil was the mainstay of Egypt's energy policy. Natural gas for Egypt, and as many other MENA countries, was viewed as being an unfortunate byproduct Indeed, it was unlucky to be able to find significant reserves of natural gas when you were looking for oil. So what many of the countries in the region did, not only Egypt but also in the Gulf region, they just flared the gas because they actually saw no use for that. And then there was a change. A change occurred, we could even say psychologically. And this change occurred, we could first see the beginnings of these changes, which occurred in the early 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, mostly in the Gulf region with Saudi Arabia in the beginning and also many of the other Gulf countries. And then it also spread to Egypt as well in the 1990s. And this sea change basically was that we can use a natural gas molecule as the impetus for economic development in our countries. So the bedrock of industrialization, economic modernization is going to be based on a natural gas molecule. Now, how did this psychological evolution, we could say, how did this occur? Well, it occurred because of several factors. One factor, we have immense economic expansion and demographic growth in Egypt during 1990s. And we also had, due to certain economic reforms, even though it wasn't necessarily trickle-down economics, we could say, but nonetheless, I mean, there was an increase in terms of the middle class, and people had much more disposable income that they could use. So, of course, there was an increase in energy consumption. And then, in addition to that, we also had expansion of educational opportunities in Egypt. Now, these policies, of course, derive from Gamal Abdel Nasser, who promised every Egyptian graduate would have a job and what have you, although most of those jobs obviously were in the bureaucracy, so that caused its own problems. But nonetheless, when you had an expansion of educational opportunities, it meant that you have to find jobs for people as well. So job creation was also key for the Egyptian authorities because you had demographic growth and then you had more graduates. And also you had, to a certain degree, more women entering into the workforce as well, which expanded the workforce, and which was a driver for increased job creation, which was needed for the populace. And then thirdly, you also had the requirements for economic diversification. So Egypt no longer wanted to remain a country which only exported unprocessed natural resources. Egypt wanted to create what we could say a modern economy, a modern industrial economy, which would have backward and forward linkages throughout the national economy and through the creation of a value-added industrial sector. So basically, manufacturing would be taking place in Egypt and what have you, and the idea was that natural gas could be the primary driver for that goal. And then lastly, we had the idea, and of course all of these are interrelated, we must not forget that. So we had the issue of the desire to increase oil revenue through exports. So if you recall, Egyptian oil production peaked in 1993. We had an increase as well in oil consumption. And of course, there's a domestic pricing policy within Egypt whereby most energy inputs were sold at below the cost of production. So basically, Egypt had a choice whether it was going to consume the lion's share, which was increasing year on year, of its oil production domestically, and it basically faced a very large opportunity cost, or should it export to international market rates? So the idea was to export to international market rates, which of course would increase foreign revenue. So those are the main reasons why Egypt moved or transitioned to trying to focus on increasing natural gas production and consumption. And that was considered to be the solution, the answer for the Egyptian policymakers at that time for all of their problems. So since the natural gas policy was implemented, and again, this is the mid to late 1990s, Egypt, in tandem with economic reforms that were also instituted during late 1990s, early 2000s by the former president, Hosni Mubarak, was able to secure significant foreign investment. And also, through this significant foreign investment in the energy sector, also made some significant natural gas finds as well. So Egypt was, as they say, sitting pretty in the late 1990s and early 2000s in terms of its natural gas position. But what went wrong? Well, we could say that, again, because this political decision that was made, we have to look at how Egypt decided to utilize the gas. So the way that Egypt decided to utilize the gas was rapid expansion of the downstream natural gas industries. And of course, we all know what that is. The downstream natural gas industries, of course, are petrochemicals, fertilizers, and what have you. And then also the energy-intensive industries. So these are industries that consume significant amounts of energy in order to drive forward their production. So in Egypt, it tends to be the cement industry. So Egypt made a strategic focus to develop these industries. And of course, even though they're capital intensive, the idea was that you could form other industries. It would have the spillover effect, and you'd create a type of dynamic environment. And Egypt had the population to foster a type of increase in domestic demand as well. So the idea was that you could have a self-sustaining economy based on a natural gas molecule that would have a spillover effect in other economic sectors as well. And then secondly, there was a major switchover from the consumption of oil in the power sector to the consumption of natural gas. So now Egypt generates the majority of its power generation from natural gas as opposed to oil. So that's another key factor. And then lastly, Egypt engaged in the rapid expansion of natural gas exports. So we have the two main LNG, or actually the two only LNG plants, which were constructed during that time, and also major pipeline projects and what have you, and expansion of pipeline projects during that time period. So the gas consumption increased precipitously because of these political decisions that were made in order to privilege natural gas consumption. However, we can see that around 2006, 2007, that's when the cracks appeared in the facade of what should have been a very good time for the Egyptian economy. And we could see that the beginning of deficits, natural gas deficits, and rapidly increasing natural gas and power consumption that were starting to reach production. So it started to happen around 2006, 2007. Then 2008, that's where you have the first major realization by the Egyptian authorities that we are facing, in the future, major gas shortages. Pardon me. So in 2008, there was a decision that was made to launch a moratorium on further gas exports, LNG exports in particular. And also 2008 was the time of the first blackout in Egypt. It was in 2008. Now, of course, what happened, these blackouts, even though 2008 was the beginning of this period of blackouts, it started to expand. It started to intensify year on year. So first it happened maybe for about a week during the peak demand period, which is during the summer, of course, when it's quite hot and air conditioning use is quite high and so on. And then year on year it started to expand. And then in 2012, no longer was it confined merely to the peak demand period, which was during the summer. Then we began to see blackouts during the winter period, which should not have occurred. And from 2012 onward, the blackouts again during winter began to increase as well. So Egypt was, and some would argue perhaps is, still heading towards a period of having year-round blackouts and brownouts. And again, I want to reiterate that this really was due to political decisions that were made. Now, perhaps some things could have been done differently, but the Arab Spring is not the fault. Or I can say that the Arab Spring was not the driver, perhaps, of these energy issues. Perhaps, at most, we can argue that the Arab Spring exacerbated the basic structural problems that the Egyptian economy and the Egyptian energy sector was facing, only exacerbated it. But Egypt was still well on its way towards facing many of these problems in its energy sector. And I would like to just briefly go into what are some potential steps that Egypt could undertake in order to resolve some of its basic energy issues. First and foremost, what Egypt should do is engage in comprehensive pricing reformation. And I think that's first and foremost. So Egypt needs to revise its natural gas and power pricing structure. And that's really the only way that Egypt could go forward, and Egypt would be able to lower consumption. And we have to understand, what does it mean by pricing? Why do you want to increase prices? Okay, we want to increase prices for two reasons. One is that natural gas pricing at the moment in Egypt is below the cost of production. So that's one thing. So you want to be able to increase prices at the very least to meet the cost of production. That's number one. Then number two, you want to telegraph to the market that you need to lower your consumption. So yes, of course, you can try to encourage the populace, and this goes for any country in the world. You can engage in conservation campaigns. But what really works is if you, how can I say, communicate to the consumers through their pocketbooks that you need to lower consumption. The best way to do so is simply through increasing prices. And of course, you're going to see a drop in consumption the very next day if you do so. So those are really, two reasons why you want to increase prices. And then two, you want to engage in energy efficiency. And then there's a push-pull dynamic with energy efficiency, so that's what we have to remember. In terms of the push dynamic with energy efficiency, campaigns perhaps, or initiatives, is that you create a type of governmental program. And a governmental program such as we have in the United States, which is best available technology, right? So you want to create certain standards that indicate that, let's say, certain industrial equipment has to run at a certain level of efficiency, air conditioners, and actually this is a major driver in Egypt because in the early to mid-2000s, you had an influx of very cheap, and I mean cheap in the classical sense of the word, I mean low quality and not just inexpensive, but you had quite cheap Chinese-made air conditioners that were showing up and very inefficient, so it consumed a lot of electricity to run. And then in addition to that, you had, many Egyptians had more disposable income, so they're able to purchase these inexpensive and cheap air conditioners, which hailed from China. So what you want to do is you want to create a type of energy efficiency regulation that would basically mandate that we're not going to have air conditioners running at a certain level of energy consumption or what have you, or power consumption. And countries such as Thailand has had quite a successful run and lowered its power consumption significantly by creating basically energy efficiency mandates for air conditioners. So this is something very important when you try to create a type of push dynamic. Now, in terms of a pull dynamic encompasses two factors. A pull dynamic is, one, a conservation campaign, and it's not entirely useless. Conservation campaigns do work, and we can see that it's worked in the US, it's worked in Europe and in other countries. So that's one thing that we need to consider, and also pricing as well. So when you increase the price of electricity, that also acts as a pull because then consumers want to purchase more energy efficient air conditioners and also other household appliances because they're going to basically consume less power, and thereby their power bills will be less as well. So that is the aspect of the pull dynamic. And then I would say lastly what you would also want to do is you want to renew, or revise actually I would say, or even revitalize, if I were to use that word, the terms of investment which are negotiated with the IOCs, the international oil companies that are operating in Egypt. So you want to create a type of incentive structure for the international oil companies that are operating within Egypt to make it attractive for them to be able to produce indigenous natural gas, and yet at the same time supply that to the domestic market, because the current framework, even though Egypt at the moment is in the process of negotiating with many oil companies, but you want to create this type of incentive structure because previously it was really not working, at least for the past several years. It did work in the early 2000s, but it's no longer working simply because of the rise of domestic consumption. And perhaps one last thing I could say is that Egypt, for the foreseeable future, is going to be an LNG importing country for a foreseeable future. So we cannot deny that. So there needs to be a type of recognition that LNG import is not only going to be a short-term fix, that it's actually it has to be part of a long-term plan to create a dynamic and flexible energy mix to meet Egypt's needs for the long term and also for job creation and what have you. And if you have any questions, please bring them up during the Q&A. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Justin.
First of all, to Rami and Alison and Colleen and everyone who's been helping on the trip, thank you very much for the invitation to come over. It's been great, and I look forward to working with all of you going forward. Egypt. Just in summary, dreadful, truly appalling. I've got your attention. That's not what I'm going to say. Very interesting mix, because very much of the coverage on Egypt I see, and it's unfortunate, after over 20 years of covering Egypt in the region, so many half-truths that go out as fact on Egypt and the region. So hopefully today we can try and address some of them. I'm going to come on to economics, but we can't really separate economics and politics as we can anywhere, Britain, America, anywhere else. Clearly, Egypt's got a new president. He won convincingly. There are challenges, and he said this in his interviews. Security issues remain an issue, but less, I think, than might be perceived internationally. Because for most people in Egypt, most of the time, life goes on as normal. And that shouldn't be underestimated. And people want to get back to work, as the president keeps mentioning. He has taken a rather tougher tone with opposition. I know some of you are looking at issues related to activists and others. I think, at least from what we can gather from people around him and what he said, he's fully aware of the challenges which Egypt faces economically. But he must act very quickly. And he needs to work both quickly and have a vision. And at the moment, I have to say, it's really quite lacking. I'd like to see more clear vision, not just talk about grandiose plans. The Suez Canal project I like. I think it's good news for the economy longer term. But you need to have more and better people in cabinet. Right now we're seeing a cabinet reshuffle ahead of the parliamentary elections in September. But we need to make sure that the individuals who are put in place know what they should be doing and do so very quickly. And you need also to change sentiment. The president needs to move exceptionally quickly to change sentiment in the private sector. Not helped, I have to say, by last week's decision to raise the tax rate for companies making more than 10 million Egyptian pounds up another 5% to 30%. I have to say, I don't think that's the right decision. I would in favor of cutting the tax rate. Looking ahead, parliamentary elections in September, probably late September, and they're going to have a mix of figures, probably some from the past, but I think there'll also be a Salafist presence in Parliament as it was historically, and a mix of others who come in as independents. And just generally, the Muslim Brotherhood is, for all intents and purposes, an exceptionally crippled organization and fragmented, but there is still support. It'd be silly to say otherwise on the ground. The projection, here we are, we've gone through a number of changes in the last year and a bit. Parliamentary elections, as I said, probably towards the end of September, at least in current projections, and a new cabinet early October. Next one. Okay, challenges ahead, security, attacks on police and military targets go on, small improvised devices across the country, many of which you don't normally hear about, but they are there, normally attacking, as I've said, security services. They've abated, but they remain. We've got elections. Some parties have objected to the draft electoral law. That debate is still continuing. But we don't really have parties that are really strong enough to win the majority of seats in Parliament at the moment. We can see a gathering of forces around some figures, Amr Moussa and others, perhaps, that will put together a party or parties that would be supporting the new president. The election turnout, as you know, there was an extra hours and extra day added to the election. But still, turnout was fine compared to Western Europe, for example, but it would have been nice to have been better. In terms of the next slide for the map, clearly problems, we know this, and you see this from the advice on travel for North Sinai, particularly in other areas where Egypt still faces problems from and particularly security problems, sometimes bordering Libya, where there was an attack on a border post, as well as I said in northern Sinai, and the number of IED devices in smaller targets around Cairo. Now here we get to the point before we go into economics, because this for me is an economic issue. There is a divide, and this is regional. It isn't just focused on Egypt. A massive change between the young and the older, put in place by satellite television, by the internet, by social media, and by travel. I have to say, younger people across the region are at an enormous remove from many leaders in the region. And I really don't think many leaders of the region, I'm not just talking Egypt here, but across the region, really get young people anymore. There is tremendous talent in Egypt, and I worked with it in investment banking. Really superb talent, and I see some of them here today, and some of them in other institutes. But the problem here is, it's an exceptionally young country, as much of the region is, and it is a divide. And I think that the body politic in Egypt and the region ignores this youth bulge that's more politicized, more questioning at its peril. And I think the low youth election turnout is a clear indication of the fact they're at a remove from the political process. And this population pyramid is very much the one that you would see across the region. And some of them are scarier than this. Iraq, for example, is one. And I think that the body politic really needs to meet the expectations of that youthful population. And it's an important challenge for this administration. And it's going to be important going forward, because population growth, according to Ibrahim Mahlab, the Prime Minister, is now 2.6% per annum. That is a security issue. It's a water issue. It's a food issue. It's a supply of housing issue, education and health. And it's something that really needs to be addressed. The economy here, you see growth at the lower line. It's actually not growing as strongly as it should. Economic growth from 2004 to about 2010 was good. Economic growth at the last economic crisis in Egypt from 1999 to 2004, actually it was a worse economic crisis than this one. The banks were in bad shape, the private sector was in bad shape, highly indebted in foreign currency too. And that is not the case now. The banks have gone into this crisis in enormously good shape. But when in 2004, then Nazif cabinet under the Minister of Finance, Yusuf Boutros-Ghali, cut corporate and personal tax rates in half to 20%. There was an instantaneous change in sentiment. As you see from the middle of the chart there, the rise in GDP growth. Post-2008, the environment became less bullish, not helped by, of course, the global crisis, and there was a slump post-2011. But interestingly, and again, don't underestimate this, because it's incredibly important, since January 2011, there has only been one quarter where growth dipped below zero. It's been in a positive situation. That's incredibly important and shows the resilience of the economy, shows the strength of the economy, the liquidity in the economy. And quite frankly, I can't think of other countries where you would have had this strength in the economy. It's still not good enough, but it shows the strength, an inherent strength of the economy. But now you need to push GDP growth, because of that population growth, up over 7% real growth per annum. But it does have the potential to grow quickly. It's a responsive economy, as we saw in 2004, because within 2 years, it went from almost 0% growth to 6% growth. But right now, capital investment is lacking. You can't see all of this in the slide, but it just shows you we've done our homework in terms of looking at the breakdown of economic growth over some years. And oil and gas, which, as my friend here, Justin, has been saying, is a key in the economy, has historically been a very major driver in the economy, has been shrinking in its contribution to economic growth. Not helped, of course, by the fact that the oil and gas companies still have to be paid back significant sums of money by the government. And tourism, of course, still lags. But I have to tell you, in the last few weeks, there has been some form of resumption of tourism, even in Cairo, where, if many of you say, there's a major hotel in Zamalek, the Key Hotel, which for the first time since January 11 reached over 50% occupancy. Some of you may not think that's important, but these little things add up to a bigger picture that things aren't always as bad as they seem. And in fact, Rami mentioned the fact that I was in Beirut last weekend, and the hotel I usually stay at in Hamra reached 92% occupancy, despite the fact that Gulf citizens have been told still not to come to Lebanon. Things aren't always as bad as they appear, and these little signs actually show that things aren't altogether bad. Labour force and employment, this is a worry, of course, because as you see in Southern Europe and the problems economically, it tends to be the young who face the greatest problems finding jobs. And joblessness is rising. That, of course, is adding to political toxicity, along with higher inflation on the next slide. Inflation, I've gone on and on about this for nearly 20 years. Inflation in Egypt has for over 20 years been above the global norm, and I am absolutely shocked and deeply saddened that it has not been made a core element of government policy in Egypt. It's unsustainable for a relatively poor country in terms of GDP per capita, for a core inflation to be nearly 10% per annum with food price inflation higher than that. That is absolutely unsustainable, especially in a more politicized population. It is a tax on the poor, and it does fuel social unrest across the world, as we saw in 2008. And clearly with El Nino this year, and all signs of it, the possibility of rising food prices this summer, which would feed into Egypt. And the drivers of this high inflation remain unaddressed, including supply chain bottlenecks. In another hat that I wear in Egypt, I'm helping to organize a conference looking at finding ways to both increase production of food in Egypt, remove the bottlenecks, including logistics, and all the way through to food retailing. If we move on to the next slide, this is where, again, Justin mentioned this about GCC assistance stabilizing the reserves. Last summer, when we had the incompetence of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, not knowing what they were doing, the foreign exchange reserves were falling very, very quickly. Now, the issue here is that clearly the support particularly from Saudi Arabia and from the Emirates have come in to help. But in many ways, I have to say, it's also led to some complacency in economic decision-making, and I would very much like to see that changing, and perhaps we can talk about that later. There was a marginal fall in foreign exchange reserves at the end of May, but it does show there's a normal outflow in Egypt's foreign exchange reserves of between $1 and $2 billion a month. And it does show that Egypt really needs to get its own economic growth moving as quickly as possible, because while the supply of capital will continue to come through from Abu Dhabi and from Riyadh, it really can't rely on that. It must do more to grow the economy and find other ways to improve sentiment domestically. The budget deficit in the last fiscal year was about the highest in the world, about 14%. Under the current budget deficit, it could reach 12% of GDP in the next fiscal year, which ends in June 2015, but that still remains too high. And clearly, again, it shows the pressure which the relatively recent Finance Minister, Hani Kadri-Dimin, who I do like, the pressures upon him to try to bring down, as Justin mentioned, the fuel subsidies, which do remain one of the keys to removing the bottlenecks in economic performance in Egypt. And here we see it graphically, the fuel subsidies. It's a shame I don't have that laser pen. Rami, we should have get one of these from the guys who have it in Tahrir, but I can't use it in London because they always say elf and safety, mister, that we can't use it. But if you actually look at the left on the subsidies, you see the growth in subsidies over time, the older numbers at the bottom growing up to the top, and you see the fact that on the left-hand side, the yellow barrier is the GASC, the wheat buying, so you see the wheat subsidy, and then you see EGPC in the middle, and then some other subsidies which is to do with health and other products. So, but you see fuel remains the key element of the subsidy. And clearly, it's a subsidy which helps the rich because the poor don't have cars. But let me give you an anecdotal evidence to show you how much is wasted. And I have to say, for the first time it was addressed this morning, and Eric and I just briefly Eric Trigg and I just touched upon this a little bit earlier. The president this morning went out on a mass public relations drive with about 1,000 people on push bikes, trying to show the importance of getting around. Well, I have to say, any of you who've been to Cairo, you take your life in your hands trying to ride a push bike in the midst of that traffic. But what he's doing is highlighting a very key issue, and that's where it's a positive move to say, come on, we really have to think about the fuel subsidy. It benefits the rich. If you drive from Cairo to Alexandria on an average car, you're being paid by the Egyptian state between 60 and about 90 Egyptian pounds. So it's about $10 to $15 per trip, by that one-way trip. It's unforgivable in a poor state that should happen. And I'm glad that Hani Kadri-Dimin and the president is actually thinking this is key and has to change. The poor don't benefit from it. I would like to see much better investment in mass public transport, trams, light railways, and the overall railway infrastructure in Egypt. And we've been arguing about that for a few years. But it's not all bad news. Food producers have been reporting significant profits. You've got a large group of people that keep this consumer market going. It could be in telecoms. It could be in food retailing, food manufacturing, for example. The chairman of Coca-Cola was in Egypt recently, announcing $500 million of investment. Samsung putting in $500 million of investment. In fact, they added in another 40 million for an R&D facility, their first in Africa, in Egypt. Other food manufacturing companies putting in money too. Electrolux of Sweden came in and acquired Ideal that makes white and brown goods, renegotiated the price, but they still came in 2011 and are doing very well for the domestic market, the regional market. A global retailer of food in Egypt has more sales per square meter in Cairo than it does in its stores in Dubai. And I think that once Majid Al Futtaim finishes its malls, and you have other malls, that Cairo could be seen to be the retail capital of the region, not Dubai. Because I'm fully aware of some of the names that are going into that shopping mall. Some of you, again, it's an anecdotal evidence to show you that it's not all bad, that this is an interesting economy. Banking remains solid and profitable, but there's some risk because of the exposure now. They become saturated with government debt, a little bit like, unfortunately, the Lebanese banking system. But the banking sector went into this crisis in enormously good shape. Under the previous governor, after the last economic crisis, the banking sector was struggling with debts. That whole system was cleaned up, and the banking sector, as I said, went into this crisis in tremendously good shape. But they're not lending as much as they should, especially when there's now a requirement for doing so. This morning, one of the banks admitted it's going to put 2% of its profits into the general fund now to help reconstruct Egypt, and saying it's going to be putting more of its effort into funding SMEs. And I should end on this point, that residential unit demand remains strong and has attracted buyers, especially in the private equity front, into taking stakes in some of the residential developers. And that's a US private equity firm, for example, that's done that. So there's interest, and Actis just made another acquisition relatively recently too. It is an environment that has positive features within it, and another group, a Saudi group, just spent $180 million 2 weeks ago buying a glass company in Egypt. But as I said on the next slide, this is an issue we constantly try to look at. Long-term challenge of population growth and water scarcity. The number we have here of where Egypt actually is, our chart, the yellow chart of population growth, now has to be pulled forward a little because the population growth numbers, it'll reach 100 million before 2030. 98% of Egypt's water comes from outside its borders. This is an enormous issue. And it has to be addressed both by better use of that water, better reuse of that water, and especially in agriculture, where if you fly in over Alexandria and down the Delta, you see miles and miles of flooded fields. That has to change. And you need an agricultural revolution to try to use water better. And of course, Justin mentioned about pricing fuel on a realistic basis. That should be the case actually across all of the MENA region, and across all of the MENA region, bring about realistic pricing of water so that people cut their usage or are much more careful of their usage of water. And it's shocking, for example, I'll give you the case of Dubai. Dubai uses 3 times as much water as citizens of Berlin, for example, in a country where that water is desalinated first. So there's an urgent need to address water scarcity and inefficient water usage. Very, very important with that population growth. So what to look out for going forward? Look at what's happening in the relationship at the top. Look at the coalition developing around to support El-Sisi. But there are grievances, economic grievances from the public, because people want a better standard of living after several years. And there have been some labor strikes that we have to contend with too. Capacity for reform. There's been economic timidity the last few years. A lot of governments have said, in figures within government, have said, oh, we can't do that, because basically people are afraid of the street. Quite frankly, if you live in fear, nothing will get done. And Egypt really needs to grip this by the horns and get moving so it can properly reform. And there's significant room for reform. Justin's mentioned that in terms of fuel, but there have been many missed opportunities in the last few years. And the reform agenda does remain unclear currently, and we do need to see priorities in the economic program. And as I've said, concern over social responses to the reform of subsidies. But I have to say, I think they're exaggerated. I think going forward, we recommend that we need multi-ministry cooperation, something that didn't happen under Prime Minister Nazif in 2004. Egypt has a tremendous human capital. Having worked in a number of cities, throughout my career, I have to say it's as good as anywhere. The people who come out, invariably though, they come from private universities rather than from state universities. But they're not at optimum levels, especially in people who work in government, at a variety of levels of government. And as I've said, we need to induce confidence to tackle reform too. We need to make people feel as if the government is really transforming Egypt economically. We don't have that yet. It's been a piecemeal approach. And the window of opportunity for Sisi to do so is diminishing. He needs to move very, very quickly. And cooperation with international institutions such as the IMF and other organizations is still vital, because it would induce confidence outside to say that this new Egypt is changing. The last slide, opportunities. Just to again mention, it's not all bad news. This figure for household debt is less than 10% of GDP. That compares with over 100% in most Western economies. Private sector debt, less than 20% of GDP. That compares with Britain, where the headquarters of lots of global companies of several 100% of GDP. Government debt is rising. It's now gone up from the last few years, 96% of GDP, gone from 70 to 96. But over 80% of that is domestic debt. And the foreign debt, which is growing, is basically is for the Gulf economies. So it's not so much a worry to me, because it can be paid back without interest over a number of years. There's a very large informal economy, which keeps everything going. There are strong remittance flows, over $18.5 billion annually. There's buoyant consumer demand. If any of you went into, as I mentioned, the supermarket on a Friday afternoon in wherever they are, the stores, you wouldn't be able to move, and you'll see people taking out large screen TVs like here. There's an IKEA where you can't move as well on Fridays and Saturdays. It's the same. There's a strong ICT and startup growth. There's a new IT hub developing. It's not as well developed as it is in Oman and Jordan, but it's getting there. With some great, I became a mentor to one of the companies in Flat 6 Labs. Really tremendous talent, some of it being nurtured by Vodafone and others, Microsoft and Google, as well as some venture capital firms. It's tremendous, really tremendous. And there's a potential, as I've mentioned, for an agricultural revolution to help transform Egypt and be able to feed both itself and the rest of the region. If I give you an example, move on to the last slide. If you look at the example of America. America is the largest exporter of food in the world by value. The second largest, I've been told, is the Netherlands. And it's in the Netherlands because it supplies Europe with food all year round, of salad food in particular, because they learn from heated greenhouses. Egypt has heat, it's got water, it can reuse it, and it's got land, and Egypt could feed itself if there's an agricultural revolution. So I've mentioned there are many positives, but the effort needed to be able to transform Egypt to get economic growth from 1.5% to the required over 7%, maybe even 8% growth is significant. So you need vision, you need the right people to take those decisions, and I have to say Egypt in its modern history has not had a good record of putting the right people in place at the right time, taking the right decisions. So the pressure is on President Sisi to actually put the right people in place and make sure that they've got set times to be able to come up with the goods that he demands, and hopefully he's going to be well advised. So far, I haven't seen enough of this yet because it's still early days, but we hope to see it quickly because the window of opportunity for him is still relatively short ahead of Ramadan, and then of course the parliamentary elections in September. So ready for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angus. Really fantastic examination of an analysis of the Egyptian economy, its challenges, and perhaps what needs to be done. Let me start with a few questions to Justin. And I'd like to ask a bit about the foreign aspect of the oil and gas issue with Egypt. Egypt used to export gas to Israel, export through the Arab gas pipeline to some of the Arab countries. Now it's turning into a gas importer, or will be increasingly so. There's a large Eastern Mediterranean offshore gas sector that's emerging. Israel already very far advanced, and potentials of Gaza, Lebanon, obviously Cyprus is moving as well. But big challenges about how to get that gas to market, which market to get it to, whether to use LNG or to use pipelines. And Egypt has been mentioned on and off in that discussion. Israel is becoming a gas exporter. Egypt might need gas. Is there some talk going on there. Egypt has LNG plants. Israel and others might need LNG plants. So my question is, what could you tell us about Egypt's energy, foreign interests, and foreign policy?
Yes, well, that's a very, very good question. And well, one thing that we have to consider is that whereas Egypt's neighbors in the Eastern Mediterranean, of course, they have much more prodigious, we could say, natural gas reserves. In particular, of course, Israel. If you look at Leviathan and also the Tamar field. But Egypt's potential stake in terms of offshore Eastern Mediterranean gas fields would perhaps just abut or overlap a bit with those off of Gaza, which actually is not that significant. So we have to look at Egypt in the context of importing natural gas from perhaps its neighbors in the Eastern Mediterranean. And as we know, there was a non-binding MOU that was signed about 2 weeks ago between Union Fenosa, which of course owns one of the LNG plants in Egypt, and the holders of the Tamar field, actually. So we're dealing with Noble Energy and also Delek as well. And there was an MOU signed between them for gas export through pipeline. And of course, this was a non-binding MOU during Tamar field to Egypt. Now, of course, this is fraught with complications. I mean, so we do know that Egypt was exporting to Israel at below market price LNG for some time period, and this has caused significant problems within Egypt, and as a result, the Egyptian authorities had canceled this contract with Israel because the allegation was that there was a fair amount of corruption that was behind this contract, and then also the geopolitical issues as well. So this contract was canceled. So importing gas from Israel, well, that's another issue. But to paraphrase what people normally say, where there's a need, there's a way. And there's a significant need within Egypt to obtain natural gas. And I think that could perhaps be one of the ways to facilitating some type of at least code peace, if not reconciliation, between Egypt and Israel. And of course, Egypt is not as antagonistic as the previous administration, or the current administration is not as antagonistic as the previous administration. And just as an anecdote as well, Egypt has also offered the Israeli authorities overflight for drones in the Sinai Peninsula for coordinated effort against certain militant activity there. I mean, so that shows that there is. Thank you. So that shows that there is at least talk going on at some level between these two sides. Now, what the Egyptian Ministry of Petroleum said, in order for this contract to go forward, well, okay, first of all, it has to be approved by both countries, by Israel, of course, and by Egypt. Now, the Egyptian authorities said, the Ministry of Petroleum, is that this contract can go forward under two preconditions, let's say. One is that it must be shown that this natural gas can add substantial value to the Egyptian economy. So that has to be proven, but I think that no one can really dispute that considering the natural gas crisis in Egypt at the moment. And then secondly, Union Fenosa, because of the diversion of natural gas from the LNG plant that Union Fenosa had, it must, well, when Egypt did that, when Egypt diverted the natural gas from the Union Fenosa LNG plant, basically what Union Fenosa did was it initiated an arbitration suit for several $1 billion against Egypt for lost sales and what have you. So the Egyptian Ministry of Petroleum said that this arbitration suit must also be halted as well. And if these two preconditions are met, then apparently this deal could go ahead. So I think that we must look at this context, Paul. I think that it's not so much what potential Egypt has in the Eastern Mediterranean, even though it does have offshore fields that can receive more investment, and I think that they would be able to produce more and halt the downward slide, but more of how Egypt is going to contribute to, let's say, regional natural gas development through the importation of natural gas.
Okay, thank you. On the energy subsidies, which both of you talked about, and obviously are key at many levels, both for the budget and for the economy and consumption and so on. Obviously, sort of moving from subsidized energy to more correctly priced energy is something many countries have gone through. What can you say from the experience of other countries, lessons learned, easier ways to do it, different impacts on different tranches of society, given that subsidies actually benefit the haves more than the have-nots in bulk in terms of energy? That the consumption often is corporations, vehicles, and things of that nature, not necessarily the poor as much. But what are lessons learned?
Well, that's absolutely correct. Well, I mean, one thing we recognize is that in a country such as Egypt, with a significant amount of its populace which is impoverished, that the subsidies operate at a regressive level. They're regressive, not progressive, as my colleague indicated earlier. So it does not benefit, obviously, as you also indicated, the poorest levels of society. So something has to be done about that. But across the region, there is a change in the air, we could perhaps say, and change in the air to the extent that most of the MENA energy-rich countries have some level of subsidization involved in the energy sector, some more so, others less so, but they are all confronting this issue with the exception of Qatar. So every single energy-rich MENA country is confronting the issue of reformation of the subsidization regime in terms of the energy sector. I would look at Egypt, though. I wouldn't compare it to, let's say, its Gulf neighbors, because obviously it has different issues. Saudi Arabia does have a certain element of poverty, of course, but I would actually compare it more to either Iran or to Indonesia. I think Indonesia is actually a better example. And the reason I say is because Indonesia, years ago, engaged in a comprehensive reformation of its energy subsidization regime. And of course, Indonesia is an energy-producing country. It's a developing country as well. And Indonesia has significant social-political unrest as well. So, I mean, I think that it has much more in common with Egypt as opposed to some of the other countries. Now, Indonesia was fairly successful in the implementation of this reformation program because what it did was it focused on several key elements. And this is what the Egyptian authorities need to do if they're going to reform the energy sector. These elements are, on one hand, education. So they didn't just announce some type of shock and awe economic program, which from one day to the next, people wake up and they're confronted with a price which is triple or quadruple what they're used to. No, it gradually led up to through the, let's say, the understanding of the populace that there is going to be some type of a change coming soon in terms of energy prices, and this is why we need to do so. Because if we continue along this way, our country's economy is going to collapse, or it's going to face significant difficulties, and we're going to consume much more of our energy patrimony and so on and so forth. So they engage in a comprehensive educational campaign, and I think that this is quite important to do. Secondly, it was phased. And so it wasn't just one broad movement or sharp movement to increase prices. No, it was set in phases with certain targets that were to be achieved. And I also think this is important as it allows the populace to become acclimated step by step to a new pricing reality. And to be honest, prices act as a type of psychological understanding. I mean, so you have to prepare the people to a certain degree, and you can't really shock them, because what this can do, it can cause significant problems. Then lastly, what the authorities did was they more or less, because there's significant poverty in Indonesia, so what they did was they created a targeted campaign. So those who were able to afford would have higher energy prices, and those who were not able to afford as much of an increase would be able to have prices which were less so. Which were less expensive. And the way they instituted this was through the creation of a targeted energy subsidization reformation campaign. And they had smart cards and things of that nature, and they were able to identify which subsets of the populace would be able to afford what. And because of this, Indonesia was relatively successful in stemming any type of major social political unrest from the side of the populace. Now, it's not going to be easy for Egypt to do so, but I would say that this tiered method of conducting this, and of course you need to have a strong administrative apparatus, excuse me, in order to do so. But I think that if Egypt were to undertake this type of policy, that it could be successful.
Thank you very much, Justin. Angus, a couple of questions. You started off with the question of vision. What is the vision? And indeed, for any fundamental change to take place, the administration itself needs to have a vision of where it wants to go. and the public has to be sold on that vision. Egypt has gone through a couple of visions. Nasser had one relating to the economy, kind of an Arab or state socialism. And Sadat announced a different one, infitah and market capitalism or managed market capitalism or something like that. And it seems to me up till today, President Sisi hasn't enunciated any new vision. And what one gleans from his statements and so on is sort of a continuation of what came before, but with a bit more cash from the Gulf, and we'll wake up earlier and work harder, and we'll manage it better, and this time it'll work. He also didn't seem to sell anything to the public in terms of, other than saying, it'll be tough, and I'm a hard worker, and I'll do my best. So my vision question, I guess, is of two parts. What do you think should be the economic vision? I mean, is there a third way between, what they tried in the 50s and what was announced in the 70s? Could that be enunciated to the public in some convincing way? And the other part of that is, what do you see as, his vision, weak as it is? He said the state's might play a bigger role than before. That's one of the
what?
The government, the state sector.
Oh.
Well, anyway, just what are your thoughts on that?
First of all, Nasser was of his time. You have to remember, put it in the context of the 50s, where my own country, Britain, was nationalising assets too. I had nationalised them in the 40s, late after the war. And in a time where there was populism too. And it's interesting, if you look back over history, the changes under Sadat and then in Mubarak. I remember having breakfast with former Prime Minister Atif Abeid at the World Economic Forum Conference years ago, and basically thinking he's a little out of his depth, and to be polite. And I think that the only really good thing that President Mubarak did was appoint Ahmed Nazif and Yusuf Boutros-Ghali and some other people there that made the changes that Egypt needed at the time. It wasn't enough. They needed to deepen those changes and institutionalize all the ministries. But what I think, and of course there was the problem of corruption around real estate particularly. I'm concerned by some of the language that President Sisi has mentioned by saying that if you want something done in Egypt, you have to go to the military to do so. I think in many ways that's a kick in the teeth of the private sector, because you've got some world-class companies, the telecoms, construction companies, amongst them OCI, real estate development companies, food manufacturing companies. And I know people who are in venture capital who've gone to see, and private equity who've gone to see some of the Egyptian companies and say they are world-class, not all of them listed, world-class in terms of their facilities. And I think that's something the president's going to have to learn pretty quickly. And I'm concerned if he wants a bigger role for the state, because the state obviously is already too large. It has to be cut. The former president, Adli Mansour, raised government salaries in the last few days of his rule by 10%. Well, in an environment of 10%, of course, people are hurting, and what he's trying to do is both win some support to keep people going, but President Mubarak, when he was under pressure, raised salaries by 30% without consulting the government first. So I'm concerned by the lack of vision so far. I think it's been piecemeal. I think the president really has to come out within a month, come out with much, much clearer vision. A friend from the Egyptian embassy has gone off before I would make any sensible comments, and hopefully they're sensible. But to say that what would my plans be, I'd launch a large debt issuance, for example, and securitize it against future oil and gas revenues, help pay off the oil and gas companies a big chunk of what they're owed, work on fuel subsidies concurrently through and other subsidies through smart cards and cash payments. And I would use some of that for mass public transport to show people that something's changing, on greater investment in education, and also leading to better services, water, potable water, and energy into places where basically there are problems. But clearly, you can't induce better economic growth until you've got 24-hour electricity. And I have to say, it shocked everybody. A few months ago in Egypt in spring, when it was a cool spring, they were having power cuts. And only a few months ago, there were 3 power cuts at home in Zamalek, and I'm living in a street where there are 17 embassies and ambassadorial residences. You can't plan a business in that kind of environment. You've got to ensure there's going to be energy growth. that meets the market demand for that growth. So we have ideas. I've given some of them in terms of what you'd do to get moving. But first of all is to have a vision, whatever his would be, and then we can perhaps criticize it better. Mm-hmm. But the key point is putting also the right people in place to do it and saying to people, and saying to people they've got to do their job. Sheikh Mohammed in Dubai, it's an economic model in Dubai I have to say I don't altogether agree with. I don't think it's sustainable longer term, but it works for the moment because the region's unstable and people are drawn to go and work and live in Dubai because it's attractive and it works. It's expensive, but it's good. But what he did when he was just the ruler of Dubai before he became Prime Minister of the Emirates is he went around government ministries at 7:30 or 8 in the morning when people were starting work. And if they weren't there, asked them why they weren't there to their colleagues. And if people weren't there, he sacked them. So he created competition and ensured that people turned up on time. You need that kind of dynamic from somebody at the top to say, you will get to work. And he could set that example. Of course, he looks to be doing a little of that, which I like. By saying to people, you will work on time and set targets for people. Because right now, the ministries, if you go and deal and you go, any of you who've been to Egypt have maybe seen the Magama in the corner of Tahrir, and you go inside and you work inside it, it's a nightmare. I know people use saying things are Kafkaesque, but this is in extremis. And it's not just for the people who go in there to get something done, but it's the poor people who have to live and work on a daily basis within it. So you have to improve the conditions of people who work for the state, give them goals, make it more efficient, and say to people, you have goals to make life better for the population. But the key point is to go back. You have to get economic growth up to over 6%. Really need to get at about 8% growth now because of population growth. So you need to come up with a plan that really changes people's mood. And right now, the maneuverability isn't the same as Yusuf Boutros Ghali had in 2004 when he halved tax. You've got to both, I would suggest, cut tax rate, have fiscal incentives for capital investment, perhaps set up free trade zones, if not around the country, change commercial law, which is archaic. Because obviously when you go into a market, you look at the downside and you look at how, if you have a dispute, how long is it going to take? And really try to create a real revolution for the private sector. Because it's a tremendous market. When I mentioned the fact that a global food retailer is selling more per square meter in Cairo, despite all the problems, than in Dubai. Mm-hmm. It's a great market, and it could be tremendous. I'm looking at setting up another business, but it's not easy. Mm-hmm. It isn't easy. And it's not an easy city in which to live, and it's heavily polluted. So there are many aspects of Egypt that can be tackled, or not the least being urban planning, for example, which looks upon the point of mass public transport. So there are some ideas, hopefully, within what I've said, but we need to do that quickly, ahead of Ramadan in early July, and of course, with the new parliament in probably October.
Thank you. Let me ask you a bit about the politics of economics. And I mean, Egypt is a very large country compared to Emirates like Dubai and so on, which have a very different political environment. I mean, politics is sometimes defined as actually who gets what, when, and how. It's about, resources. And also a leader is only as strong as his allies and his coalition in the long run. One can be popular for a while and so on. The old system under Mubarak had its moguls, had its economic czars and so on and so forth, some of whom are reappearing or still around. President Sisi has said we will not go back to the old system, and we will not have the same faces and so on. But at the end of the day, what do you see? I mean, you've said that he needs to pick good people, which is sort of the technocratic side of things. But what alliances will he make? I mean, obviously he wants the state to be with him, the bureaucracy and so on and so forth. He wants some alliance in the business sector. Troublingly, to my mind, during his election campaign, he didn't reach out necessarily, to the public to say, well, other than say, give me time and I'll deliver some results. But in the public, what type of alliance is it with the middle class, with the underclass? There doesn't seem to be a clear political coalition that is going to accompany any political vision. I mean, an economic, the vision isn't even clear, but the alliance isn't clear. And what troubles me is it's looking possibly like the old economic alliances, which might then produce the same results.
Okay, so what's your question then?
The question is, who are the forces that will align with Sisi or are currently aligned with them, and when the going gets tough economic decisions And they're going to be winners and losers.
Okay.
And he cannot give everything to everybody. Is it
Sure.
to the rich, to the middle class? Where is he going to stand?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, what he did say is people are going to have to work, and it's true in many ways. When you've got uncertainty and instability in a country, you've got to get people back to work, but you've got to give them an incentive too to say that things will get better, which comes back to vision again. He's got to really come up with a firmer plan to say this is what I want to do. It isn't just an airy-fairy plan developing way west of Egypt and this using water to create a new city. I don't agree with that. I think that the Suez Canal project, I think, makes sense as long as it's well planned and well executed. Could make very good sense because 8% of global trade goes through the Suez Canal. But I think it's interesting you mentioned this about political alliances because the body politic in Egypt is fragmented, enormously fragmented. So it has to be rebuilt. And I think that as long as I have to say, I was going to mention the name of somebody who was former foreign minister. I would rather the body politic is developed by younger people. Because in a young country, there's tremendous talent, really tremendous. And I see it at play with some Faluli characters try to influence disproportionately in New Egypt. This is an Egypt for the young, for the future, where there should be hope. So I want to see people in their below 40 involved in the body politic, if they're allowed. I'd like to see that, forming political parties. But it's not helped by sometimes the diva-like behavior of certain people. I don't know if you invited some of them here. You know the one with the shaggy hair? I won't mention his name, Rami. I don't want to embarrass you here. He will set up a party and then break away from it, set up another party. People have got to grow up very, very quickly. And within their parties, stand for something. You've got to stand for something and say, what is it this party represents? I don't really see enough of that. And I don't want to criticize Rami for your involvement in politics in your party historically. But we need to say, what is your platform? What is it you're standing? What is the vision of the parties? So where are the president's alliances? Well, at the moment he tries to be slightly all things to all people, but that's not very much. It's not much. It's a tenuous alliance. Mm-hmm. And as I said earlier, it's an alliance that won't last long in an environment that continues to have high inflation, that has low economic growth. And people keep saying, wait, you give us time. Well, there isn't, not with population growth. The population is growing now by 2.5 million people a year, near enough, just under 2.25 million people a year. The pressure's on all politicians. So the issue is, I say, that he's got to make those alliances by what he does as well as what he says. Mm-hmm. And he's got to do and say more and clearer and very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Angus. We started late because of the rain. We'll take a bit more time and we'll turn it to a Q&A.
My name is Michael Albin. I'm an independent researcher. Both of you have mentioned the importance of education in Egypt in the development of the economy. What has been the impact of the revolution since January of 2011 on the educational infrastructure, and is the current infrastructure up to the job of creating the cadre of workers that you say the country needs?
Okay, Igor Silva, I'm an interested citizen. How much of the economy is controlled by the military, and how Sisi is going to deal with it?
Thank you. The lady on this table here.
I'm Laura Daniels from European Parliament. You spoke briefly about the budget deficit, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit on retrenchment and the timeline for it, and what the appropriate way to go about it would be during this particular socio-political context.
What should the U.S. do about trying to stimulate the Egyptian economy, trying to encourage the sorts of programs that Angus was talking about? In terms of our economic aid, should we reshift our military aid towards more economic? I mean, these are all sorts of discussions that we're having, and would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you. The gentleman on the right there.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on what Egypt is doing to differentiate itself from other emerging markets writ large and other emerging markets in the Middle East, because it seems to me that their old value proposition of being a stable country with a good business climate, with great opportunities for tourism, other countries have those now, and so those rules no longer apply. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on what Egypt is doing to gain a competitive advantage over other countries in the region.
Yes, well, what I'd like to do, there weren't many energy-specific questions, and that tends to be my focus, although what I would like to answer, the gentleman over there spoke about the Egyptian military and its role in the Egyptian economy. Well, I think what President Sisi represents is a type of retrenchment, or not even just that, I think even expansion, a great expansion of the role of the military within the overall Egyptian economy, and I think that goes without saying. But at the same time, though, even though we tend to criticize this, we must understand that the military really is the only viable, is the only standing, the only respected, really, institution in Egypt at the moment. So if you want to get something done, for better or for worse, you do have to go to the military, and the military does have the connections, even though we do want to see the private sector take on a greater role and what have you. But we definitely do see an expansion of the military within the overall Egyptian economy, and even within the energy sector. And I think that this has been an issue even because, for instance, at around 2012 or so, there were certain energy companies that wanted to get permits, and certain permits for exploration, what have you. And these had to be, of course, obtained from the military. And there were issues where the military was not granting permits expeditiously. And so it led to delays and so on and so forth. But in reality, I would even say that perhaps the military was a bit more quick or rapid with that than even the Ministry of Petroleum would be post-revolution. So this is the conundrum that has to really be dealt with. But at least in the energy sector, we can see that it has grown. And even in terms of many of the Gulf patrons at the moment, such as the UAE, which is investing significantly in the Egyptian economy, the UAE tends to want to deal with army-linked companies because of certain issues. And it seems that the prevalent view is that the private sector is a bit more rife with corruption and may not be up to the task for some of the major projects which are envisioned. Now, I'm not saying that this is accurate, but it seems that this seems to be the view emanating from certain sectors within the Gulf or what have you that are thinking about investing to at least a certain extent. In terms of education, I was speaking more about instrumental education, so I wasn't speaking about education as a whole. So in terms of education, there needs to be an educational campaign which is focused on trying to create an awareness within the Egyptian populace as to the need of conserving electricity, conserving power, and what have you, and more or less a type of environmental or ecological awareness of the impact of their energy use, at least on the country and on the overall energy position of Egypt. So it was more of an instrumental sense. And Egypt really hasn't had that before in terms of having some type of detailed educational campaign in order to inspire a type of ecological awareness within the populace. But I think that there is scope for this now due to, as Angus mentioned earlier, due to the impact of the young people within Egypt and due to hope in the air, notwithstanding the previous, of course, situation in Egypt where it looked like despair. But I think that the young people obviously would have a role to play in trying to create this type of awareness, which would go a long way in terms of lowering energy consumption. So to that extent, that's where I think education will play a role in the instrumental sense. Of course, now broad-based education is important, but what I referred to, though, was a very specific application of an educational campaign. So I think that would be quite important. Now, in terms of shifting U.S. focus in Egypt, well, I think that there is the perception, and of course this perception is across the region, and I don't necessarily think it is accurate, but nonetheless it is the perception that perhaps the U.S. was a bit too friendly with the Brotherhood and what have you. This is a perception, unfortunately, in some quarters, and I think we must do much to dispel this perhaps misplaced and ill-informed notion. But nonetheless, in certain countries in the region, that was the idea. So I think that now we must realize that Sisi is here to stay, and that Sisi is perhaps the most viable leader Egypt has had in a long time, and we need to support him in his quest. So I think that we need to come out strongly and support Sisi. And I think also through support of Sisi, we can help him with some of the tough decisions that need to be made in terms of economic reformation. And Sisi, I think, is quite serious about economic reformation. He's quite serious about this because the challenges are quite extreme. And to focus on the energy sector, within, I would say, the next few months, we're going to see some bold statements made about reforming the energy price in Egypt and how to go ahead with that. And I can say it's just within the next few months. So I think that as what the U.S. could do is take the bull by the horn and help assist Sisi in that, perhaps with advice, perhaps with, I mean, Egypt doesn't need IMF help at the moment because it has Gulf assistance, but nonetheless, I think using international institutions as well as the support of the U.S., I think that this could help him stabilize his position. Thereby, Egypt could undertake a much more harmonious transformation. And then I pass on to Angus for his ideas.
Thank you, Justin. Yes. Angus?
Education. Every country complains about its graduates from schools and universities. Everyone. Your private sector complains, the British sector complains that people are leaving, they can't write, they can text only. They can't even speak English properly when they leave school in Britain. Any of you who visit Britain now, I go back to Scotland, I don't understand now half the population. Forgive me for those watching in Scotland if there are any at all, but it's quite true. A better curriculum in Egypt, I know making light of it, but a better curriculum would work wonders in Egypt. That's more creative and creative thinking, a bit more like even Jordanian or Lebanese education system. There's far too much learning by rote. And I think that I helped organize a conference. I'm on something called the British Egyptian Business Association, and I proposed and we organized a conference to work with some British groups to come up with some new ideas. There are a number of small-scale, usually very small-scale programs across Egypt to help add to the curricula, but not enough. Not with so many young people. It needs to be broadened and change the national curricula. I remember a few years ago when the authorities decided to put some new questions into the exams at the end of term. You had students fainting, parents fighting because it hadn't been put in the curriculum. I don't want to make light of it. It's vital for Egypt's future. As Korea showed, as Singapore showed, as Malaysia has shown in 2 generations, it can be done. I think that but it starts with changing the curriculum and paying teachers better. And I'm amazed that I live in Zamalek, and there's a school near me in Mohammed and East Pasha Street that in its time when it was built would have been really good. But there you have students going in and there's no air conditioning, there are hardly any fans, they're living with broken windows, and even in good areas. So you've got to start with the physical infrastructure of schools, as well as the curriculum, and pay teachers better, so that people, students, when they go to school, actually are learning something that would be useful for when they emerge. In terms of the military and the economy, I'm not an expert in this. I've never had the desire to look at this because financially it's not worth my while looking at it. But what I'd say is there's a lot of half-truths about military and their involvement in the economy. I disagree with Justin by saying if you want anything done in Egypt, go to military, because that's what Sisi said. I don't agree with it. It's a kick in the teeth to the private sector to say so. It's an enormously good private sector in Egypt that can get things done. I think that if you actually look at it, for example, one company makes cars, another company makes pasta, another company makes whatever, water, bottles water. But the fact is it's in a highly competitive environment, and other companies have far bigger market shares. So the percent of the economy is way, way much lower than some people suggest, who actually shouldn't really state otherwise. But where there is an issue is over real estate, and you see that through the deal which the military has made with Arab Tech of the Emirates. And that's, again, I would have to disagree with Justin about companies wanting to deal with the military only in Egypt. There are many alliances between Gulf companies and the private sector, or acquisitions by companies from the private sector in Egypt, where, for example, the military decided to work with Arab Tech of the Emirates to build 1 million houses, low-income houses across Egypt. It's admirable, but it's also highly unusual that the government should have done it rather than the military make that statement. Undermines the government, quite frankly. And of course, in the end, it should be state land, so it raises a number of questions. But I have to say, I think the role as a percent of the economy is lower, far much lower than people would suggest. But the fact is, under the stimulus program, a number of military companies, the military were winning elements of that stimulus program. And of course, military companies don't pay tax. So if they go and get deals, the fact is, it's not like usual companies that would pay tax, employ people who pay tax, and so on. So that raises an issue. In terms of, I wasn't quite sure, Laura, of your question. Can you rephrase it?
Just the budget deficit, you talked about that.
Yes, the budget deficit. Well, we addressed some of it. Justin's rightly mentioned about tackling fuel subsidies, tackling also better focusing food subsidies by stopping the black market in both commodities is important. And I think that's one way to do it, to cut. But of course, the other element, of course, is to grow the economy. If you do that, you raise taxes. So you've got to maximize economic growth as quickly as possible to bring that budget deficit down. The reason why it's rising is, of course, the economy is not growing very strongly. Tax revenues are not as good as they would otherwise have been. So we've mentioned also some ideas to try to boost economic growth. Eric, what can America do? Well, we'll talk privately about that perhaps. I have to say what I've been recommending in Europe and the UK particularly, and I've been saying here to some people, is perhaps think of looking at different ways, more creative ways in which to help Egypt and other countries by looking to develop human capital. As I mentioned, Egypt has tremendous talent, as you can see now in the growth in the IT sector. And I would look at ways, for example, I would set up, if there was enough money, because there is certainly $1.5 billion going in every year, you could set up another university, another American university to train people in American standards and do it for underprivileged students, not for the rich. I would have programs to bring more students over to learn in America, for example. I would have large-scale training programs, vocational training programs, because you have superb engineers, for example, here too, and various sectors to go and help train and improve the quality of different vocations across Egypt. That would work and would have tremendously good outcome in the overall economy. I would promote culture too, tremendous culture. Everybody watches American films. Everybody, like here, watches Game of Thrones. Downloaded, I have to say, the same day it goes out. But everybody watches culture. I remember saying to one private equity investor a few years ago when Ugly Betty was all the rage, he didn't know what it was, but I said all my analysts at my investment bank knew what it was. They watched it every week. So culture is important. Try using it as a way to get through to people to show that because they're interested already. Not just the rich, but the poor. And microloans. I would love to see a real microloans company, a bit like the Prince's Trust of the UK. I've been mentioning this. Prince of Wales has a trust in the UK that's worked exceptionally well called the Prince's Trust, where he gets, through private donations and from concerts undertaken by artists that raise money, and it's got a very low cost to try to look for ways. But the issue in Egypt is bureaucracy. If you set that up, you'd have to be governed by financial laws far more restrictive than you'd have here or in London. And that's such a great shame because it would really work in Egypt where it's really, really needed. But these are just some ideas that you could be doing. What does Egypt do to differentiate itself? First of all, on the positive side, I'd say it's about one of the largest, apart from Israel and Saudi. It's an exceptionally large emerging market. It's not unimportant. It was until recently in the Goldman Sachs next 20 countries to watch. The British Trade Ministry too, the next 20, although they've taken it out, the next 20 for the moment, countries to target. It's an important market domestically. As I said, that diversification is an important, very large consumer market, which I've mentioned. But is it doing enough about it? No, because you need a better economic plan. But it's that many countries don't really have plans at the top. You just go along and you develop organically and so on. But of course, Egypt would benefit from having some clearer goals to try to say, this is what we're different. As I said, I was in Oman a few weeks ago, and they're struggling to come up with what they are in the world. So economic growth can't really grow until they really find out what is their differentiating factor. But in the case of Egypt, I think it's enormous liquidity. It's a very large market in itself. You could just if you opened up the right business, make a fortune in Egypt. It's a bit like if you go to Nigeria. But a lot of entrepreneurs don't like going to new markets. They like to go to places that are easy. When I covered the UK years ago, I remember I covered a company that's now broken up. But the management said, we don't go to countries where they don't speak English. And I thought, well, that's a lazy approach. There are many companies, too, in London that have been coasting for years, and in Europe, where the management would rather go and play a round of golf or go sailing than go and really go to markets where they could make an absolute killing financially. The world, many people think they go to emerging markets, but actually many companies don't. I'm trying to get companies interested in going to Egypt to look at it in the retail market, but they won't get off the backside, to excuse the language, because they think it's comfortable enough, they think they can grow enough in the UK and elsewhere, in Europe, for example. But if you go and look at Egypt, there's a tremendous market. Some British companies have already moved into the molds in Egypt, are doing exceptionally well. So there's a role for both growing organically and by having some vision and some plans, of course. But it's already a highly diversified market that should be attracting greater interest, including companies like your own.
Again, I want to thank the Tahrir Institute, Rami, Nancy, Allison, the whole team for bringing these excellent two panelists. I found it extremely interesting and useful and important. Thank you all for staying with us, and please join me in thanking our two panelists, Angus Blair and Justin Dargin.
Thank you.